Joel Kotkin is the author of The Coming Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. And he recently penned this piece for Spiked Online asking whether or not we've reached the high water mark of woke. I'm almost too scared to, I've read it, but I'm almost scared to ask this because maybe there's something new. Joel joins us now to discuss. Joel, really appreciate your work, and I loved your piece, and I'm super excited to dive into your book because this, I mean, at some point, I feel like enough is enough. So when is this going to end? Have we reached, peak wokery, for the lack of a better way to say it?
Well, I think the most hopeful sign, frankly, is not conservatives jumping up and down, because you could assume that they're going to do that anyway. It's the fact that people in the middle and even on the left are beginning to say, this is not what we thought of when we thought about liberalism. I went to Berkeley, and the idea of the free speech movement being a left-wing movement is no longer applicable. And so what you're seeing is large numbers of very important writers in particular, and some people in the entertainment industry, particularly journalists who are traditionally liberal, Andrew Sullivan, Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, Barry Weiss, all saying this has to stop. So I think there's pushback. I even noticed in the New York Times occasionally a little less of the party line now than, let's say, 6 months ago.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points, and especially with Taibbi. I mean, he and I have argued on television before, but I find myself reading his work now, and I'm like, actually, yes, that is correct. And it's not because he or I have changed. It seems like everything else has. And when you have certain people that are pushing, whatever, the hyper wokeism, it makes everybody retreat to these politically tribal positions, which are as awful as the wokeism itself.
Yes. Well, one of the biggest problems with wokeism in its power in the media, academia, is it just means that people just don't believe what they're reading. So some of them go to the right-wing media, which I don't believe any more than the left-wing media. But the reality is, if you can't trust the New York Times to be remotely fair, you're going to look for other options. Or you're just going to say, they're all lying, and I'm not going to have anything to do with it. But I mean, I've worked at most of those big papers in my life, and yes, they were always liberal, but it was never sort of baked into the core mission. The core mission was still journalism, objectivity, give both sides, inform the public. That consciousness is almost completely gone.
There was something that you had acknowledged and in your piece where you were talking about Gen Z. They seem to be the most hostile to this sort of this cultural phenomenon, which that's really good news. I mean, I'm raising Gen Z, and I always say, it's because I'm baby Gen X raising Gen Z, and Gen X we were so cynical, and we were the latchkey kids. Maybe we're raising, future cynics too. Maybe that has something to do with it. What can you tell us about that?
Well, what we're seeing, which is very interesting, this is polling that Sam Abrams has been doing, and other people have come up with the same thing, which is basically, first of all, I have a 17-year-old. And as she says, I can't stand the millennials. I dislike them even more than the boomers. So I mean, some of it is sort of one generation rejects what the last generation did. What I also notice is in my classes, with my students are now pretty much all Zs, much more open to debate. I don't get, I can't think about this. I feel scared. I think I've had maybe one student recently who said, Ben Shapiro's coming to campus, I don't feel safe. And it was so absurd that I said, just don't go to the appearance. This isn't the meeting of the SA, the brown shirts. I mean, this is just a intellectual guy who maybe disagrees with you. Why is that a threat? But what I found really interesting is 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I felt much more pessimistic about free speech than I do now. I do think these young people are beginning to wake up, and they're not going to become Trumpistas, I don't think, in most cases, but they are open. They're open to argument. They're open to thinking about things, and they don't want to repress everybody else. But the reality is that these kids realize that they have been fed a diet that is really, they can't really swallow completely. I mean, nobody who wants to go to school when your professor is scared? Now, I'm fortunate, I'm old enough that if all hell broke loose, I'd be okay. But if I'm a 35-year-old teacher going for tenure, I'm not going to say anything about anything. Today, we even see weird stuff where we've had cancellation of science lectures by somebody who wrote something that just simply he wasn't in favor of affirmative action, and therefore he's a racist. I mean, the anti-racist ideology, I think, which is at the core of a lot of this, it's just not sustainable. It can't work. You can't have an ideology based on everybody who's white feeling guilty, and Asians feeling guilty because they're white adjacent, and God knows what they mean about Hispanics. So I think there's a pushback, but that pushback can't be from the far right predominantly. It has to come from the center and even from liberals. And I think that process is starting, and I'm very glad to see it. I consider myself an old-fashioned liberal, and
a classical liberal,
and I can't understand this idea that, for instance, you're going to ban the Barrington Declaration on COVID, which comes from PhD. No, I don't. PhDs at Harvard and Cambridge and places like that. I don't have to agree with them, but they shouldn't be blocked off. Steve Koonin and Mike Schellenberger, who are lifelong environmentalists, maybe have a different take on climate change than the party line. Should they be sent to what I call the digital gulag, where we just completely ignore them? I mean, it's one of the great tragedies I've seen, at least for me as a writer, is I used to, when I would write a book, I would be on CNN, I'd be on MSNBC, I'd be on NPR, and I'd be on the conservative outlets too. Today, it's very difficult for anyone who doesn't follow the party line to get on those mainstream outlets anymore. And that's terrible for debate.